All right, welcome back to the Design, Build, Hunt podcast, which is presented by Whitetail Partners. I've got a full crew on the line with me today. I've got Greg in Ohio, Tim and Sam, both in Wisconsin. Guys, it feels like it's been a minute since we had this many folks on the show.
Good to be here.
Yeah. Greg, I think you are in the most exotic location right now. You're a little further west than the rest of us. Where are you at?
Yeah, I'm out in Seattle for the summertime. My wife's working out here, so I'm shacked up in the mountains. And yeah, there's not much like the Midwest out here, but it's still been pretty fun.
Yeah, there are worse places to spend a summer than Washington. I have to say.
Definitely.
There are worse places. And you've been, I thought it was good to go to Washington. I thought it would be a lot of fun, but I think you've kind of been being tortured here lately. You keep posting things where someone has made you run for miles on end.
Yeah, that's my what's the word I'm looking for? It's my alter ego that tells me to go out there and do that every day. I don't know what it is.
Man, I feel bad for you when I see it. I'm like,
give it a few years and your knees will get louder.
Oh goodness. Well, gentlemen, I'm glad we could reconnect here. We're looking at the end of July, actually, or end of June. So which is really strange. It feels like June just got here and it has breezed by already. But we're right up against that time of year when folks are starting to get their trail cameras back out in the woods. We're really starting to see some progress on a couple of bucks. I've had clients sending me pictures in the last week or two where some bucks are really starting to show, what kind of potential they're going to be having. So I'm curious to hear about you and how much importance you place on those summertime trail cameras. Like, what role does that play in your hunting arsenal? Tim, let's start with you.
Yeah, for me, in full disclosure, I don't even have cameras out yet. I know some folks are really, excited about getting them out right away, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But typically for me, it's around that July timeframe when I start to really get those cameras out there. And as far as the role they play, I think there's a couple things they do for me. Number one is when I'm starting to try to get a sense of what the herd looks like after the winter and now the spring has come. What does fawn recruitment look like? What do deer numbers in general look like in my area compared to previous years? So kind of collecting some of that census information, so to speak. And then the big one, the one that we all love, is to start getting those buck pictures and start to kind of inventory what's around right now. Some of those up and comers from last year, are they still there? And what are my target bucks going to be this fall?
Right. Are you seeing a lot of carryover where you're hunting from those summertime bucks into the fall? Or is your property one of those that just sees the massive shift where it's like, well, we had them in August and now they're not here?
We do see a pretty big shift on my property. And really, I would be curious to hear what the rest of you who own property experience on your own. But I think, some of that is maybe the area that I'm in, but I think some of that is too, is how you have your property set up and what type of habitat you have. I've got a lot of really thick areas in the woods, not a lot of breeze coming through at different times. And I think it's areas that are hot and buggy this time of year, and the deer maybe don't necessarily prioritize that. But it's that same habitat that come fall, those thick, secure areas that they're going to actually start to really target when they want to feel secure.
Right. Right. Very good. And that's, maybe a principle that we can kind of get into as this conversation develops is we're developing fall properties essentially, right? Like we is it nice to hold deer? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, we're developing and designing a property for the fall when we're actually going to be able to be in there and hunt it. Greg, let's hear about your trail camera strategy. I know this time of year is pretty important for you, especially with some of the public land stuff that you like to do.
Yeah, so I actually just got a bulk of my cameras out last week. I made a trip back to Ohio and got those set up. Generally, I like to use like the 4th of July as a good time frame of when I like to get my cameras out personally. I mean, like Tim mentioned, it's nice to get them out early. I just don't really necessarily have a lot of time to get out earlier in the summertime to get them, but I like to really just focus on general social areas in the summertime just to get a really good idea on what type of deer I'm working with in the area, if deer from previous years are coming back. So kind of like what Tim mentioned in those hot and buggy areas where you're not going to see deer. I like to focus in places like draws where you're going to get like a nice thermal pull and it's going to be a little bit cooler as deer are entering and exiting the fields where they're feeding in the evening time, mineral sites, water holes, things like that. And really not holding too much weight as far as how I'm going to hunt these deer come fall time, but at least get an idea of, are there any deer I was targeting last year that are still hanging out in the same area, and then kind of already having in the back of my mind where they were hanging out the previous fall. So if that deer is there, I know he's going to fall back into those same patterns come fall time, so I can kind of start setting up my strategy accordingly.
Right, right. Sam, how about you?
I echo Tim's comments quite a bit. I mean, I don't get my cameras out until July, usually. And for me, because I've hunted this property for a number of years and we've had it set up, and really we know how they're going to use the property in the fall. And really it's for us, it's about inventory, knowing what's out there. I really like to have the ability to make that, have that thought process and decision process on which buck is which in advance of seeing them, and because we're managing tightly on that, where there's a lot of hunting pressure around us, so we're managing tightly on what is and what isn't a buck we want to shoot. And because of that, I really want to have my mind made up before I get in to that situation where there's only seconds to think on it. So I really want to know that in advance, and that's really what the purpose is. I have seen both though. You ask about is there that shift, and I always say it's so buck specific and individual. Some do hang on. I mean, the buck we shot last year was one that did hang on from summer into fall, had that same core range, and we killed him right where he bedded. And that didn't come until later in the year. But that, so you might have that, or you're going to have ones that come in at different times. And in fact, I'm also looking back on past records to say, when was that time that this one showed up? Because that's a hunting strategy, hunting season topic a little bit more, but seeing when they came in, because that's something I might be looking for this season again.
Yeah, I really like that point that you just made on a lot of this is so buck specific. I feel like in hunting media in general, there's this whole like, oh well, it's the September shift or whatever people want to call it, and it's um, i- is it true? Is there some shift? Yes, but are there bucks that don't shift hardly at all? Absolutely, there are, and we see that a lot. And I think we would all agree it's very very buck specific. Have you seen
Well,
any consistency when it comes to the size of that shift or the distance of that shift? Do you feel like on the properties that you hunt, you can say, "Hey, he's going to be, uh, you know, shifting a quarter of a mile or half a mile or whatever that looks like"?
yeah, and we talk buck specific. I also want to add to that. It's the influences. How are things changing? The food, the food we have on the property that we control, that's going to change coming into fall because we've strategically done that. Also, hunting pressure, whether it's our own or the neighbors, all of those influences are going to come to have an impact on that buck. And if we're able to hunt wisely and know what those things are, how those things can happen, what we see is bucks enter some of these areas coming into that fall food time frame as the food changes, when harvest occurs, and when food especially is really changing, browse is changing. That's when we see a lot of those movements, and they become a little bit more wide ranging. But then that also dovetails into pre-rut, and how they're starting to cover more territory with signing and those sort of things as well.
Right, right. Really good point. Anybody have something they want to add to that?
I think the one thing that you hit on, I think this is really important, whether it's summer trail cameras or anything else, is I think that you can never get caught up on there being an absolute in deer hunting. I think that we've all had enough experience now to realize that you can read and learn and have tactics and everything, but there's never a guarantee. You have to really be able to read your situation. And I think that's got to be the most important thing, because even if something is supposed to happen, that doesn't mean it is going to happen the way that it's drawn up.
Right. Yeah. Very, very good point. Very, very good point. One thing that I'll throw in there, that we don't quite have in some of the areas where I hunt that you guys do, we don't have the agricultural influence. And so for us, we oftentimes will we see a shift in the way a buck is using an area? Absolutely. But will we see a major shift where he's 3 miles away now? Probably not until the rut. It's not until the rut that the neighbors 2 miles down the road got the same buck on the camera. Shifting from summertime into the early season, even into mid season before pre rut kicks off, we're still having the same bucks. We don't see the kind of shifting, and I think it just has to do with our food sources don't shift as dramatically. We don't have soybean fields that are harvested. We don't have corn fields that are harvested. We've got standing pine plantation and whatever's growing underneath, and maybe we plant some food plots where we can get one in, but not seeing as much of a shift. Now when you get into ag country, we do see the same big shifts and whatnot that you do up in the Midwest. But let's talk about locations, some of your favorite spots to be putting trail cameras this time of year. Maybe just share your top one or two. One of the things I had Tony Peterson, you guys may know of him from his prolific writing in the hunting space. I had him on a podcast a couple of years ago, and I was talking to him about this topic, summertime, trail camera pictures. And I was asking him, where would you put this? I would put it here, but I don't necessarily want to get all the bean field pictures. And he was like, deer like soybeans, right? I was like, yeah, that's a really good point. He's like, so why do you need the camera there to see deer and soybeans? Like, okay, I'll put them off the field a little bit. So kind of shifted that trail camera strategy just a touch, but I'm curious your top places for the summer, because I do think there's a place for the soybean field edge camera.
Yeah, I can jump in on this a little bit, Josh. I think certainly, to Tony's point, we know that deer like beans, and so we don't maybe need that to educate us on that. But I think that even on a sizable food plot or an egg source, you can use these summertime cameras to start picking up little subtleties about maybe where deer are entering or exiting a field, because there are certain terrain features that might just lend themselves to this. I think Greg mentioned it a little bit, finding some of those lower draws. They might be a little cooler. There might be a breeze coming through. But on top of that, those same draws might be, hey, there's a road just, across the field, and this draw is a little more secluded, a little more protected, where a deer might come out into it 5-10 minutes sooner than just, another 100 yards up toward the road. So trying to zone in on some of those little things where it may not be the same deer, it may not be every time, but that's just a typical spot where a deer is going to enter and exit a field. And that could actually help a little bit during the hunting season, beyond just knowing that that's a food source that they're going to like.
Yeah, certainly. Sam, what are some top locations for you?
Well, I'd have to say the bean field is absolutely one. I mean, from a standpoint of inventory, that's a given. So yes, to the
Right.
point, and we've belabored that a little bit here too with, but just to know what you have, that's an obvious. One of the things I like to do though is put cameras near my, I'll call them easy early season hunts. So these could be wide open field edges, not necessarily a bean, but maybe it's a tight little passage along the edge of a cornfield, or a place where I can very, very easily get in and out in the early part of the season and have some pretty low impact hunts, and not be diving in. I'm not trying to find out, call it the Buck's bedroom and where he's at and the details of that, so I can go get him on day one. I want to know those easy field edges, and most of my summer hunts are going to be that last hour or two of a late summer evening, and that's when I'm going to go to those sets and want to know maybe there's a chance. And if I am getting pictures, then I'm studying them to say, why did this happen? Was it a wind direction? Was it a temperature? Was it a condition that caused this? And maybe if that situation presents itself coming into the season, I'm going to try and be in that spot.
Right. So you're really thinking through strategically, like, how do I get some hunts off early in the year without putting too much pressure on my property? And so going ahead and having some cameras in those locations so that okay,
Mhm.
September 17th season comes in Wisconsin, you've got it covered and dialed in.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. Greg, other locations where you like to stack yours?
You know, and I know I mentioned this, Tim said it too. I really like those draws leading into the ag fields. That's just like a hot spot for deer activity coming out into those fields, and you don't quite get as many pictures as you do, and if you have it like right on the edge of the field and it's not super high impact getting in there. Other than that, like things that I'm focused on. Especially if like I'm going out on a piece of public land and running cameras, I just like to focus on easy access. Like the woods just get straight up nasty in Ohio in the summertime, not very fun to walk through. So anytime I can utilize like a creek access and just kind of pop right up off of that and put a camera on the edge of it, or even right on a creek crossing, anything like that. I just like to try to keep things as easy and low impact as possible. So just that's really what I'm shooting for when I'm hanging these summer cams.
Yeah, I really like that point, and I'll kind of piggyback off that just a little bit when it comes to, hunting some of the public land spots that I do. Traditionally, my tactic has been I'm just going for proof of life with summertime trail camera pictures on public land. I'm not trying to figure out exactly where he's bedding today. I know where he's probably going to be during the pre-rut and rut. When I'm really going to be getting after him is probably going to be a little bit different. I just want to know where he is. Interestingly, I had a buck that I was chasing in Wisconsin and got some pictures of him. Couldn't figure out exactly what he had done, but I had proof of life, so I knew he existed at least. And once I harvested the deer, a couple of other people knew the deer as well. They were able to kind of tell me a little bit about what he was doing. We had pictures of him in a soybean field that were sent to me early, during the summer as he developed. He shifted down about 600 yards to a different part of this piece of public where someone found him and started hunting him really, really hard about 2 weeks before I did. And so another guy had cameras in that area. When that other guy started hunting that area really hard, he disappeared from that area, disappeared from those cameras. That's when he popped up on my cameras, and I was able to harvest him that year. And so just a really unique take on just having proof of life keyed us in. And, we found out the rest of the story later, but proof of life was good enough to put a hunting plan together and eventually catch up with this deer. It would have been nice to have all of those pieces that all these other guys had the whole time, but that wasn't really feasible. Let's talk about setup. I had an experience a couple of years ago. I was living in Louisiana and I was hunting a place. There was a wildlife management area. It was a pine savanna, which if you've ever seen a pine savanna, pine trees scattered every 50 yards with tall grasses about the height of your head in between. The number of deer on this property was absolutely insane. I tried to put out trail cameras and I went out and checked. I don't know, I think it was 4 or 5 cameras I had on this property. And I did not get a single deer on this property. Not one. But if you sat in a pine tree and just looked out over the savanna, you saw deer after deer after deer. You'd have, 10 or 12 deer in a morning that you would see. So it's very, very hard to pin these deer down. I made a couple of really critical mistakes when it came to setting these cameras up. So I'm curious if you guys can give me some tips that maybe would have addressed some of the things I ran into. I won't tell you what I ran into just yet, but what are some of your tips for setting up summer trail cameras?
Josh, one of the things that I think about here too is getting back to it's that summer and even summer intrusion. Obviously, we don't want to have intrusion too much into the fall. We're very careful at that time. I think that in general, I've been just free will run around the property in the summertime, and if I bump a buck or whatever, I'm not too worried about it. However, I would say as my property is becoming more and more developed and I don't need to be in these places other than to check things, is to try and combine efforts of maybe I'm going to make sure corridor is cleared one last time for the summer, for the season, and I'm going to combine that effort with getting my cameras out there just so that I'm not in there more than what's necessary. And also, even on these routine sets where I've had a camera on that water hole, let's say a number of times, I'm going to pick a different tree this time and put that camera at a different location just so that there's variety out there, and getting that camera in a different location, or maybe it's just down the corridor from that water hole. All I want to do is see, I liked your choice of words, the proof of life, and see, is that buck moving through there? I don't need to get every single perfect picture at that water hole from the same camera, the same angle, the same everything I have in the past. So adding a little bit of variety in there and also reducing impact. I still like to use my cell cams on those more interior sets, my water holes that I'm never at other than, to hunt a few specific times, that will be cell cams into the season, to reduce impact. I'm starting those up now here in July and letting them run and making sure that there's no issues with them. So I'm not needing to run in other than, maybe a fresh set of batteries right before season starts.
Right. Right. Any other hacks, let's say, or tips or things that'll help you when you're trying to get those good pictures during the summer?
I think there's a few different maintenance tips or tricks that you can apply to make sure that you're getting good pictures. I think about those times we put out a camera in June or July and we say, we're just going to let this soak until maybe I'm going to, pull a card September right before the season if it's a low impact area. So it's out there for a couple months and there's nothing worse. And I'm sure you guys have done this on public land too. We leave it out there and we get back and we're so excited to check the chip. And I've got, there was a branch in front of it the whole time. The camera was actually turned down a little bit more than I realized. I mean, those
Yep.
are heartbreakers, right?
Yep.
Uh, and so I think there's a few things we can do to make sure that doesn't happen. For me, I'm always clearing out more area around the camera than I ever think is necessary.
Right.
Because it is, as things grow up and they lean over, all of a sudden now they're in front of the camera and they're getting false triggers. I've even gone as far as taking Roundup out and spraying around the base of the tree or the post that I'm putting it on, so that even if I cut it down and it won't regrow and get in front of those cameras. Something else to do too, if you have a little SD card reader that you can plug into a phone or a laptop like I do, I'm not afraid to actually go out there, set the camera up, walk back and forth a couple times in front of it, pull that chip and make sure, hey, this is the right angle. It's far enough off the trail that the trigger speed is going to catch the deer in frame. All those little things that you can do to start adding up and get more quality pictures and make sure you're not missing bucks, passing through.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. So you just nailed it. One year, one of my properties in Wisconsin, I put up a bunch of cameras for turkeys. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to let those soak. The farmer's coming in. He's going to plant soybeans. This is going to be amazing. My summer plan is perfect. And I pulled those cameras and I had thousands upon thousands of pictures of nothing, of field side grasses blowing in the wind. Um, it was not a good day. I lost a lot of what could have been valuable data. A couple things though. There are good trail camera apps out there right now that can use AI and help you sift through. So if you do have an instance like that, run them through one of these programs where it can take 10,000 pictures and figure out, okay, these have deer in them, and so therefore we can scrap the rest of them. Those are super helpful. But Tim, one of the things you mentioned, one of my favorite trail cameras right now, and we're not necessarily sponsored by anybody or anything like that. But one of my favorite trail cameras allows you to Bluetooth to your phone. So I can go stand out in front of my camera and see exactly where I am within the frame. And so I can go stand at different points and it will show me live on my phone exactly where I'm at in front of the camera. That has been really, really useful. It adds a couple minutes to the setup, but you know what I don't do? I don't get in there and think, I couldn't see far enough, right? Like it's aimed exactly where I need it to be. But that tip about the roundup and making sure you clear out enough in front of your cameras is a very, very real thing. Greg, do you have anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, a couple things. First thing, for the angle and everything like that, I know what I like to do. One of my good hunting buddies showed me this a few years back. Is once you hang that trail camera, and if you take your phone and place it at the same angle, right on the lens of the camera, and reverse so you can look at where it's facing, then you have that whole view of what your camera is going to see, and that's pretty accurate. I've used that, and those are nice for like when you're running non-cell cameras. That's when I really like to use that. So that's helped me a lot with the angles, because there is no worse feeling than catching all of those grasses or twigs or anything, or not having your camera pointed at the right angle and you're only getting legs, whatever that may be. The other thing for me is I'm a big no ground scent kind of person in front of my trail cameras. I try my best not to walk out in front of it, which is partly why I use that phone. But that's where I like to focus again on my access getting in. So I'm not afraid to go into an area if I know like there's a good little CRP field that has some buck bedding in it. I just put a camera up in a pretty tight area that most people probably wouldn't be going into, but I was able to walk up a creek and step off the creek not even 5 feet and hang it on that first camera in a shaded area. I know that the bucks are going to be passing through as they're working and bedding in that CRP field. So that camera, if you're looking at it on a map, is very high impact, but I was able to have that water access all the way in, and I felt fairly confident that I'm not going to bust anything out of there by doing that. So those are 2 quick tips that I like to keep in mind when I'm out there.
So one of the things that I like to make sure to do, Greg, you mentioned there a shady spot, is making sure that in the timber, you can kind of get away with pointing your cameras really any kind of direction that you want them to be. But if you're on a field edge or something like that, you need to be careful of east-west facing cameras. You end up with a lot of glare, you end up with a lot of false triggers, and it can be somewhat of a headache. So, but I thought I would end with this. So, I guess it was a while back, I shared one of the properties that we had been working on in South Carolina, where we had set up a design for a client. He got in there, got right on it. We established a new food plot and put in a new travel corridor that leads to a clear cut. And we had to get creative with this travel corridor because it was wide open timber between the two. And so we did some forest stand improvement within there to really thicken things up, cut in a travel corridor, put in a mock scrape. It's looking really, really good. And he has a buck on there that's been somewhat consistent. And this was June 17th. I'll see if I can just pick it up here and show the camera, but this was June 17th growth for a deer in South Carolina. So he's looking pretty good. He from the side, you can tell he's got a little bit of age to him. So we're real excited to see, what he's going to turn into, but just a little bit of velvet there for you guys that don't have your cameras out just yet. So anyway, guys, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it, folks. Hopefully you learned something about your trail cameras and how to get them set up for this summer. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us either online or through social media.